webinar. Our discussion topic for the day is cybersecurity in the age of COVID-19, and I'm your host, Ben Doan with SageNet. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to cover just a few housekeeping topics. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be able to share a link with you after the event is complete. We welcome you to revisit the content yourself and share it with colleagues. We also invite your comments and questions. So please look at the Q&A chat box on your screen. And if you think of any questions for the speakers at any point, please just type it in there and I will either pose it to our speakers at that time, or I will hold it for the discussion portion at the end of the event. Note that there are handouts also in the panel which have some relevant information on the discussion topics. And with that, I'm excited to introduce our panelists. Joining me today, we have Courtney Radke of Fortinet, Paul Truitt of SageNet, and Corey Flynn of EG America. Courtney is the Retail Chief Information Security Officer at Fortinet. Paul Truitt is the VP of Cybersecurity at SageNet, and in his former life, ran security practice at a retailer, Wawa. And Corey Flynn is the head of IT security and infrastructure at EG America, which includes one of their largest North American brands, Cumberland Farms, that you may have heard of. So welcome, gentlemen. We thank you for being here today. And yeah, wow, what a year it has been. I think it's safe to say that this past year has certainly been one of the most unique years that each of us has experienced. And as we think about the coronavirus and the global pandemic, we turn our attention to the impact that this has had on business, and obviously, even more specifically on retail business. So you each bring a very unique perspective to the conversation, and I'm excited to learn about those in your thoughts and perspectives in our time here today. So let's dive in. The first question that we pose here today, as we know about COVID-19, and it led to rapid innovation, including the curbside delivery, mobile payment platforms, increased digital signage, enhanced carryout and drive-through services, and touchless payment technologies, all things that we're probably all familiar with, in our own personal lives. But Paul, I want to pose this first question to you and getting your perspective. So how have the security controls been adapted to address new security risks with each of these technologies? And are there any best practices to ensure that security scales at the pace of business?
Absolutely. We've seen a ton of changes during COVID that were all done very rapidly. Things like adding digital signs, both inside and out, self-checkout stations, drive-throughs, cutting holes in the side of a building to put a drive-through in. Mobile checkout, meaning expanding your checkout to be over Wi-Fi, which prior to last year, most of us probably said, absolutely not, never in my store will we ever do such a thing. And we had no choice but to do these things to survive. And, they're all great changes. It's accelerated. I mean, each of those would have been a project all on its own, a huge project all on its own that probably would have had operational challenges and evaluations and defining the impact of that to your operations and defining the impact to your security controls. And a lot of those things had to be shortcutted because of the speed to market to survive. And some of the things that we've seen, and this is through assessing a lot of our customers, or really just helping implement some of the control changes, right? Some of the requests that come in from a managed firewall services provider, things like endpoint security. These new devices didn't really get the endpoint security, which is things like hardening standards, right? So how do we harden those devices? How do we get EDR technology deployed to them and functional and working and not breaking it? A lot of those things were shortcuts were taken that may or may not be there. One of the big ones that's extremely scary and makes me nervous is the lack of segmentation. We saw networks, whether it was wireless networks that, our customers were forced to utilize existing Wi-Fi that was deployed that wasn't intended to have cardholder data traversing it with POS systems attached to it, start using those Wi-Fi networks. Some of them even expanded them outside. They had to do that in order to get the device working that they were using if they had a faux drive-through or a curbside delivery that they were trying to do checkout at people's cars. Without things like appropriate segmentation or standing up a separate segment, Wi-Fi segment for PCI purposes, without WIPs installed, wireless intrusion protection systems. Things like event logging, monitoring controls on systems that just you never did that with before, but are now transporting sensitive data. We miss some of those things. And then, the other one that we saw a lot of is connections between systems that never had sensitive systems attached to them before. So, being able to put on digital signs that sit outside to let a customer know that their food is ready. There's a whole lot of that type of activity with systems that were never touching cardholder data processing systems before. One of the big things, and I think what you asked here, Ben, is what are the best practices? I think all of those problems exist. My guess is there's 10 times that number of challenges and risks that do exist. The biggest thing I recommend is treat those changes like an emergency change control, right? Consider 2020 the emergency, right? And consider 2021 the post-emergency change control window. I get it. That's supposed to be the next day. Well, let's call it the next year just for fun. And let's pretend like 2020 didn't happen. Let's look at it in 2021 as the time to really take a better look at what we did in 2020 to survive. And let's make sure we stay surviving in 2021 and forward, because making sure you put those lockdowns in place, it's okay to not have done it. And it's okay to go back now and take a look. Doing things like pen tests and web application pen tests and having third parties come in and assess your organization to make sure that you didn't leave those risks there are all critically important. Pull your firewall rule sets. So I'll pause there. I could probably go on for the entire session on that.
Yes, I think that those of you that know you, Paul, know that you can go on and on and on. But yeah, jump in, Courtney.
It's all applicable. And I think you said it right, that, these risks were expanded, they were scaled. I think that was the biggest thing. COVID-19, the last 12 months, didn't create digital innovation, right? It accelerated. And the same with the security risks. The risks were there, right? A lot of businesses were already moving towards digital innovation. We're putting in a lot of technology, but I think the speed and scale of this was the thing that caught, some off guard. So some doing it for the first time, some maybe doing it the wrong way. As you said, segmentation was maybe not always top of mind. They needed to make sure that business was moving forward. They needed to reach customers, and at a time when if you didn't have a digital presence and your customers were asking for it, that's the only way you could reach them. In the restaurant space, at a point, there was 95% of customers were served in off-premises or off-lot type scenarios, either drive-through or through a mobile app or something like that. You had to do it. And so, I think that the challenge here with COVID-19 is, rapid innovation is great, but rapid innovation a lot of times breeds risk. And I think, I love that treat 2020 as the emergency change control, but change control does mean there's auditability, there's processes, what you did, you document what was done. So now you can unravel that in 2021 to see, was it done in the right way? Does this match my ongoing security policies, my security posture for the rest of the year? So best practices is track what was done, right? There was a lot of stuff thrown at the wall, see what's stuck, see what's really gonna fit inside of your organization going forward. And as you said, make sure the technology that you're bringing in is segmented correctly, that it's not, causing problems for you down the road. We saw that a lot with retail previously as new technologies came out, and COVID-19 again just accelerated some of that, scaled some of that. And we're not just talking at the branch anymore. Now we're talking really, into the cloud, into where customer data traverses and resides. 99% of the data going into and out of retail organizations is coming from the cloud. We're not to the edge compute space yet. It's all going into the cloud. So we also have to account for that, where some of these retailers were not used to having multi-cloud environments, not used to securing those environments that they have to today. And I'm sure that, I could continue to go on and on as well, but Corey, you're coming from the space where, we're having an outside view, but obviously we know the space, but you live in the space. Yep. So maybe you could talk to some of that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Paul. One of the things I noticed for me, the challenge, we were in a unique space because not a lot changed for us in a whole, because we were a retail organization that was considered critical mass because we deliver fuel, and people still need that. Frontline workers still need gas, et cetera. So there was that. So we were allowed that fluidity. But the thing I noticed was two things. One was because of COVID being how can we help our employees? How can we help the world? Social distance, wear masks. And now going into a store with a hoodie, glasses, and a mask was not something where you would normally, in 2019, you'd call the police, or just, if you were a small owner, you probably had your own arms, and then you had someone else at gunpoint. Now that was the norm. You're going into banks and stuff. So obviously there was the whole mantra that everybody but no one was socially profiled. So the thing that I noticed is because of that separation, there was a grave uptick in physical attempts to compromise security, skimmers, just general scams and theft, because now you can't check an ID when the person's like, do you tell a person to take your mask off? Like things like that. The flip side was our workforce drastically changed. In the stores, nothing changed. Obviously, we have people in the stores. In order to run the stores, still, we're going to have a diminished workforce based on the COVID, but we're not going to have that same hold true in the office. So we went to a completely remote workforce overnight, and that was not only something that we were not prepared for at scale, but it was counterculture. Because the organization prior, for those of you that know Cumberland Farms, were very old-fashioned, old school, and EG acquired Cumberland Farms, and a lot of the top-level executives came over from that, and the culture kind of merged. So some of the other brands we own are Loaf and Jug, what's the other big one? Certified Fast Track. So they were a little bit taken off by that because it was a little bit different. But for the most part, it was kind of old hat. It was like, all right, well, wait a minute. Remote workforce, that's unheard of. That's crazy. So we had to make sure, and to Paul's point, segmentation, we had to actually do some desegmentation, because we were designed in a certain very static environment. And I had because I'm in a unique position because I own infrastructure and security, I had to basically put on a hat of security and then say, oh my God, I got to throw that out because I can't stop the business. And what it helped me understand was having things documented, but also testing the documentation, because I'm a huge proponent of zero trust, including internally. But for those that know me, I am huge on documentation. I ram it into every rank of my IT group and the security team. I'm like, if I don't see documentation at some point throughout the process, then I consider it a risk to the organization, and it goes right to the risk register. And the item with that I noticed the most was the incident response plan. We always put it on a security practitioner's pandemic, but we all put it there and laugh. And I can say personally, I have laughed when I put on pandemic, and I laugh and say, yeah, it's never going to happen. Spanish flu, age is a medicine, and look what happened. And it's not something you can test. You can try to test, but it's a great lesson learned where when the worst happens, not only are you going to have diminished staff and possibly have to bring in third parties quickly, and now you're trusting, third party vendors, but also in the case, I see some folks on here from, like, say, P66, we have sites that are branded fuel. Now we have to accommodate their security programs into our security programs, and what I think is best for me might violate contracts, EULAs. Best practices for them might violate their security program. So there's a lot of dynamic pieces going on, and you've got to look at it and say, okay, what's best for me? What's best for the customer? What's best for our partners? And like Paul had said, and Courtney had said, come back and do it as an emergency change. And I tell everybody, the only time I'm going to be really, really upset is when I go back after a change is done, which I probably already know and have approved or given you liberty on, and then go back and say, why didn't you open the ticket? You had all the time in the world now to do the ticket and do it right, because you had all the information post change to put all that in there. And I think that's key. I know I use this as a learning tool, as just 2020 post-mortem, and say, what could we have done documentation wise, playbook, run book wise, to aid us in facilitating the business quicker and responding to these items quicker, so we knew what we were able to do.
Yeah, it's I would imagine every business is thinking about just this rapid innovation, and changing the way that we do things, and then adhering to the formal. How do we formalize that into a process and documentation, and then so that we can follow just standard procedure and allow that knowledge transfer to the teams, disseminate quickly. And you started to touch on, and that's why I advanced the slide here a little bit when you were mentioning some of the technology that and interfacing with customers. And I'll pose this back to you, Corey. So what else changed, via the digitization to the customer interaction points, within your organization? Are there some specific things that you can highlight there? Yeah.
Yep, a great question. One of the biggest things we found is more customer outreach. So we had recently debranded what we call our rewards, or Smart Pay. If you're Cumberland Farms familiar with what we call our Smart Pay rewards program. And they had debranded the credit card piece of it because you were allowed to buy certain things through the credit card. The company, just prior to the pandemic, thought that it was too much of a risk. It wasn't really used that much. So they had said, you know what, we're going to get away from that. And then the pandemic hit us, and then a lot of companies were going contactless payments, and we weren't there. So what we did was kind of a hybrid. We let the business kind of drive on that, and we looked at historical and forecasting data on what the top items were being sold in our locations, and we found that it was things like tobacco, some liquor, and then basic items, and pizza, because we sell pizza, and I guess a pizza was a huge item. So we actually did a kind of a morph on the contactless payment without the payment piece. So what we did was we fortified the application, rolled it out to a wider audience, and then offered the key items that the orders could be done curbside and then picked up curbside. And then the payment, we just shuffle the payment in and then back, kind of like a self-service gas station would. The only difference is, in addition to gas, we would offer, pizza, soda, and things like that, and then walk the information in and out. So we kind of didn't change the payment process other than putting a human in the middle. And that was to accommodate a lot of our security constraints around things like PCI, third-party vendor management and stuff like that. So we kind of adapted, but stayed the same, if that makes sense. And then what I did on that note was ratcheted up things like Paul had said, monitoring what's different, because the footprint changed. So what was normal yesterday in the new norm, which is anything but normal in my opinion, we just had to adapt to that abnormality in traffic flow and start trying to watch historically what's happening, so we could then pick anomalies out of that and say, okay, let's deep dive into that.
Yeah. Courtney, what are your thoughts from the technology vendor perspective and working with many customers? What sort of trends that that you have observed during this time that you could share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the US, we're always lagging behind on the newest and the most approved, the best, most secure payment methodologies. And I think what this did was drive forward adoption of contactless commerce. And it's really great because I've seen a lot of things, or what are the security concerns around having contactless payment? The security concern is not having contactless payment because it takes a lot out of the responsibility of the retailers, right? There's predetermined limits on there. You're locking it with biometrics. There's proximity. There's a lot of built-in security functionalities built into contactless commerce, which it's a silver lining. We've started to move forward and adopt. We were very, very far behind. We were one of the worst in the world in fully adopting the ability to do contactless commerce. So I think not only allowing for that, but also getting it front and center that you have to have robust behind the scenes infrastructure. You have to update your infrastructure to support not only these new payment methodologies, but new ways to meet the customers. And so as Paul mentioned earlier, a lot of times it was maybe they had a wireless network or a guest wireless network or something else, and now they needed to put on tablets or order taking or line busting or something else. It started to get them thinking of, yes, I brought this online now, but maybe I should have a separate network or a more robust network or something else, because this may be a long-term thing. And so I think it just got a lot of organizations thinking, not even if things change, right? Even if things get better, we all hope they will. This will be a business practice that's going to continue because it's continued all over the world. We were just lagging behind, and we needed to make sure that there was the infrastructure processes set up to do it. Now, I think processes was kind of the biggest thing, because you talk about card not present, you talk about the transactions deficits that card companies put on it when you're making mobile transactions versus a card transaction. Those things have to change, and I think they will. But by and large, retailers, organizations are starting to embrace contactless commerce. They're starting to embrace this more touchless nature that is going to require technology to support it. I think it's been a good thing for technology. It's accelerated technology growth by at least 5 years. Things that were already there that we should have been doing. I think that's my biggest thing. I came from retail organizations that we had very, very widespread customer points of presence. We were a very digitally focused company. And I think a lot of the industry is now starting to catch on to that.
And to add to Courtney's point to Ben and Paul, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, is not only the contact payment side, but I know I've already reached out to my acquirers and heavily been pushing them to things like almost mandating P2PE or chip and pin, because as Courtney said, Europe has been the front runner. And I have conversations with, because the company I work for is global, so I have conversations all the time with, like, for instance, PCI, and they're like scratching their head saying, why the hell is PCI so difficult in the United States? And I said, because we're back in the 1950s with security. The merchants, and if any merchants are on the call, I apologize, but liability transfer is inherent. It gets pushed from, it rolls downhill to the merchant. And unfortunately, the merchants in some ways want that, encryption, that point-to-point encryption, to wash our hands of it or minimize and logically segment the areas of risk. But unfortunately, with that comes plausible deniability for the merchant, and now ultimate liability for the acquirers, which obviously when you're coming into a zero-sum game, nobody wants liability. I'm not going to say any different of the acquirer myself. I want to pass it to them, they want to pass it to me. It's the way it works. But I think it's hopefully, fingers crossed, going to be a wake-up call for the industry, not just locally, globally. And at least we'll get to the 21st century of consistency, where they start realizing that credit cards haven't changed much since they were enacted in like the 30s, from knucklebuster days. And I think it's time that, as if you watched Happy Days, it's time we jump the shark and get on the other side of that and kind of put the stuff in that, like Courtney said, we already had in place. We already have this technology. It's just people fear change, but now we're being forced to go down that road, and I'm welcoming it, because it's going to make security a lot better.
Yeah, for sure. You mean, Corey, you think the fact that we had imprinted on our cards the sensitive data that the retailers are required to protect is not sensible? So I do want to make one comment on one of your earlier statements. And Corey, I've got an extra security hat. You said you had to take yours off for operational purposes. I would be happy to get you a new security hat. But yeah, the only thing I'd add here,
I want to size it up.
the only thing I'd add here is the other thing we saw a good bit of change from a there's no way I can say that word.
Digitization.
That's the word.
It's a tongue twister.
The only other thing that we saw happen a lot is online payments. And so I don't think we really talked much about that, but almost every one of the retail, especially food service organizations that I do business with, all went online. And I know a lot of them did it with plugins and third parties that they utilized, but there's interactions between those third parties, and whether it's your point of sale system or somehow your ordering that goes on. And that's another area that's probably needs to be reevaluated. And I probably should have talked about it earlier around the, those gaps that get created by connecting systems from third-party vendors that we didn't have before, and we did it in an urgent fashion, do create some potential risk.
Well, Paul, your online payment introduction was an excellent segue into the next slide. I don't know if you did that deliberately or not, but I
you knew what slide was coming.
It's almost like I knew the questions in advance.
Absolutely. So I guess, I'll pose this back to Corey, because you did mention about, of course, you guys continue to sell fuel, and not only fuel, but also pizza and the food that was in the stores. And so with the pandemic brought a change in customer behavior, for sure. I mean, we saw that. I'm sure everybody probably on this call has done some sort of carry out or pickup service that you didn't otherwise do a year ago. But so how did the change in web or mobile purchases impact your business, and did this security profile or attack vector require changes to be made, and kind of extending out new controls that maybe weren't otherwise previously there?
It's a fair question. In our case, we were fortunate that I guess we were old fashioned. So we had already had in place what's called a smart pay platform. So we didn't take credit cards through that for mobile fuel payments. The users could come in, they could do contactless with that, but it was tied to a debit or a bank account. And that was already implemented. So it was just a matter of scaling that out. So we just needed to really look at the ping, power, and pipe side of things to make sure we could handle those. And then I was doing, and my security side of my team was doing cursory looks at how the data was stored, making sure we're not violating PII requirements and things like that. Because while PCI was not in this, forum, CCPA was or is, PII, mass data protection. And for those of you that work in that side of the house, you know that we're like Europe was when the Queen's doctorate came out, or directorate came out. It was a Wild West, and we're the same now. So to me, it was the uptick in volume, but the business decided, whether it was right, wrong, and different, that we didn't want to rapidly integrate credit card payments, because it would probably take us too long, and we knew we'd probably do it wrong, and it would probably break things, so it wouldn't work at all. And then on the flip side is the security aspect. We didn't feel outweighed the risk of going through all the the rat's nest of connection points to the third parties or quick service restaurants, PCI, CCPA, all of that stuff. So in our case, it was more of just a facilitating it. How do we facilitate, run the pizza out to the person, take the credit card, and what does that impact? And then just scale the apps up to make sure that we had, the throughput, because that's where we really got hit. Is our business model completely flipped to, I think it was 20% online and 80%, I think it was like 60 or 80% online orders, but not being paid and processed. And then we had to do that internally still.
Yeah, I think, again, it goes back to the scale. So even if your processes didn't change, it's the magnitude at which they occurred. And so, most retailers, they're in one cloud or they're in multiple clouds. And I think, as we talk about having to scale to customers, they've built a baseline. They know how many customers are going to be coming online per day, paying per day, at least making orders per day. And they had that set up in their environments. Maybe some of them didn't have elasticity in their cloud environments. They had to manually spin up things to support that. But if they did have some elasticity, they were a CI/CD shop, continuous development, maybe pushing out multiple revisions per day. Security probably didn't expand, wasn't elastic, right, to expand with the amount that they had to bring online. So as these retailers started to see, as you said, now we've shifted to 80, 90 or more % coming in from online channels. They had the ability to expand those mobile web application platforms. They had that, but they built security as we expect this many, and they didn't build it with elasticity in mind. So they were either not putting it in or having to figure out ways to expand with their environments. And that was just if they were in one cloud environment. That was just for one application. Now talk about a multi-cloud environment, multi-application environment. We know that there's multiple APIs involved in all of these processes as well, coming from different third parties, and there's very little. You talk about Wild West, there's very little standardization when it comes to third-party API integrations. So now we're talking about, where do you focus on security? They still had to focus on security at the edge, and then they had to focus on security into the cloud environments and into multi-cloud environments with elasticity. And so I think this is where a lot of companies look to, what things can I do across multiple clouds in an elastic model for security, because they knew they needed it. They didn't know how to do it. A lot of them were doing it for the first time now. I think that opened up, a lot of retailers or a lot of companies' eyes on, what does security mean in the cloud? There was this, perception, this shared responsibility model of, if I put it in the cloud, my security's there, right? No, right? Cloud providers are there to protect their infrastructure, protect you from their themselves from your, mistakes or something that you do, but they're not protecting your applications. They're not looking at code analysis. They're not protecting you unless you layer on securities. And I think that, again, a lot of retailers started to realize the cloud's not just some secure thing I can throw it up into. They've got me if something goes wrong. You know, they're good at protecting infrastructure, and they're good at protecting their infrastructure from you. But you need to layer on some security in the cloud. And I think that that became very apparent to a lot of retailers this year.
Yeah, and one thing too that it just, when you were talking, Corey, it poked my brain of something that we went through, and it wasn't necessarily payment related, but we started having more web-based forms for contact. So that way, because we knew people, you know, weren't going to walk in and ask questions. So that was a big uptick as we started really ramping up the ability for customers to complain, ask questions, get guest services. And one of the things we noticed is that one of the things that we noticed was
That may have been a customer complaint, by the way.
yes, it was like, that was really weird, almost like you guys planned that. I was looking real quick. I was like, oh God, I was like, which phone is that? One of the three that I have ringing. And what I found was, like you had said, we had a situation where an application we scaled out and we didn't realize that the pipe was going to not be able to handle the uptick. So we actually had the cloud-based application, but the backend application, we had to move to another data center. So that required us to very rapidly change firewall rules and make sure we didn't cause a business outage. On the flip side, the non-payment aspect of it, there was some speed to deployment to fill a need. And what happened was we caught after the fact that it wasn't data validation in fields. So we were getting a bunch of porn spam through bots in the web forms because links could be embedded in the link. And the way it had to be set up, because it was internal, it was bypassing our email security system. So I had an emergency circle of the wagons to say, all right, hey, can we reroute this through the security system? If not, you guys got to very rapidly deploy data validation for these, because if someone clicks on one of these and it's not in all of our tools, it only takes one thing and we're screwed. And it was kind of a wake-up call, because thankfully we had the documentation, and that's what caught it. But had we not had that documentation and had that, you know, foresight to go back through the post-mortem, it probably never would have been caught, unless, God forbid, you know, the FBI knocked on our door and said, hey, you're a point of presence, a common point of presence, you know, zero for a breach.
And let's hope that's not the driver of that. But yeah, the only thing I'd add here is you know, I think the behavior of our customers has changed, and so any security controls that we built based on that, I think, you know, trying to profile how a customer is working with us. I think Corey talked about input validation controls. You know, some input validation controls may be based on parameters that we knew or expected, and they're different now. Maybe it was other control frameworks of monitoring that we were doing that were looking for specific behavioral types of our customer interactions. And those are different now too. And, you know, that's really reflective of this web ordering, web purchasing. I mean, you know, I personally, all of my behaviors have changed with the way I interact with retailers that I interacted with before. And if you built security controls based on how I used to behave and think that they're still going to reflect my current behavior, they're not going to see it. And my guess is what Corey just talked about is potentially lifting some of those controls, or saying, look, security guys, I get it. You guys had built all these really cool things. You have all these dashboards. You have these alerts that come into our security operations center. They're stopping business from functioning, and you got to turn them off. And so, you know, whether it's that we've just got to reevaluate those and tweak them, whether it's we actually can go back to normal, I don't know that we ever will. But, you know, the cat's out of the bag on this whole, you know, curbside delivery, because I'm never walking inside of a retailer again if I don't have to, if they'll bring it to me.
But you bring up a really good point, Paul, is the rapidity in which changes are made. I also saw a large uptick in false positives because certain logging became enabled because features were enabled and it wasn't tuned locally. So now the security team had to deal with the backlash of cleaning that mess up because the business needed something, they deployed it, it worked, but they weren't thinking of tertiary connections down the stream. And I know that was a big thing for us, is scrambling. We scrambled, oh God, the middle of the summer when they went back to lockdown in my area, we had to scramble the deaths almost weekly. And it was always some stupid, oh, someone turned on logging, oh, someone did this. And it was just, it was getting to the point where I thought my team was going to miss things because of fatigue, because it was like, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Every day it was something, and it was never anything. And then I was noticing a drop in the morale and the human response factor, because they were just like, oh, it's a complete BS ticket, don't even worry about it. And I'm like, you can't think like that, because it's the one time, you know, that's what thieves do. They look at the noise and say, I can blend right in and slither through. And that was a wake-up call for us.
Absolutely. Every breach I have ever helped a client recover from, the event was in the flurry of other events, right? The needle in the haystack was found post-event, and majority of the time, one of their best investigators or one of their best responders was the one that closed a ticket related to the actual bad thing. And that's what it is, right? It's if you've got 1,000, I don't know how to, whatever the term was, but if you're never going to see the needle in the haystack if you've got so many needles around it, right? The one that matters is never going to be visible.
The needle in the needle stack is what you're looking for.
That's the one. Yes.
Needle.
Yes.
So thinking about security controls and kind of moving us through the conversation here, I advanced the slide into a new question. You know, have user-based controls deployed pre-COVID remained relevant? And did anything need to be changed based on new user behavior? I think, Corey, you started to touch on this a little bit, but I kind of posed that to the group.
Yeah, I mean, they were definitely relevant. We've had a lot of great things that we could have done for user-based controls. It just goes back to, a lot of it is, were they being used? Were they being implemented in the correct way? It's not that a lot of these things were new, right? User behavior analytics, network baselining, doing some of these things that, when changes happen in an environment, that you could organically change your security policies to match them. Problem being, a lot of it was still manual. A lot of it was still static. A lot of it was still people building firewall policies or building new baselines at that point in time instead of doing it dynamically or automated. So I think the user-based controls that were available pre-COVID have definitely remained relevant. The user-based controls that were in practice, probably not. I think people quickly figured out that they needed to change rapidly to support new business processes, new remote work processes. We think about it now, my work hours are a whole lot different, and my locations are a whole lot different than they were 12 months ago. Not that we want people working at 4 in the morning, but sometimes there's people working at hours just because, they didn't work the full day before. They wanted to get up early, get a head start. Maybe they just couldn't sleep. Doesn't matter. Now they're empowered and enabled because their office is their home now, and we had to account for that. Previously with anomalous, and it may still be anomalous, and as it kind of continues back to the point, is it bad? Is it good? We have to reset the baselines and expectations, and we have to be able to, our SOC teams need to be able to cut through the noise and determine, is this person that is allowed to work anytime during the day doing legitimate work? It goes down to, what is that person now doing? What data are they accessing? Have they ever accessed this data ever before, regardless of time of day? That's where it becomes anomalous, not the time, not the person, maybe not even the location, but the what is happening. It's the action. I think that's where we kind of need to change, and we need to get into an era of adaptive security modeling, adaptive policy creation, where we don't have to have somebody manually there opening up a door to let work proceed, but when we still have to have eyes on it, cut through the noise. But it needs to be more flexible. Security cannot inhibit the business, but if security is not there, you may not have a business. So I think there needs to be kind of a little bit of ebb and flow, but it definitely needs to be more flexible, and a lot of people learn that.
And I'm going to jump right into the next slide, because I think that leads us into this question as well, is what technologies or processes have helped extend the necessary security controls to a newly remote workforce. Those of us that are working from home and in our closets, and it's a shift in how we do things. So, we see, I think you hit the nail on the head, Courtney. We don't have a commute anymore. There's people that had a 30-minute hour commute, now all of a sudden have an extra, hour to 2 hours of potential productivity that businesses are absolutely seeing the benefits of. And so we're seeing longer work days from employees, and getting more things done at odd hours that would have otherwise been a standard 9 to 5 type of increase of activity online. Now it's it's kind of around the clock. So yeah, I mean, what do we think about the question posed here?
Yeah, I mean, I would propose the first thing, and we can push back on Ben here. You know, we instead of restricting people when they work in places like their closet, right? We need to actually
Defense in
better
depth against the kids, but go ahead.
we need to better understand who that person really is, and you know, the more control we can have, right? The good old VPN is really no longer the best answer, right? I think we do need an enhancement beyond that, a better level of access control, a better level of evaluation of who that person is. And by the way, with everybody logging in remotely and a lack of some of those security controls, if you aren't running multi-factor on the front of your VPN, you're in real trouble, right? I mean, because everyone's coming in that way now. And so, you know, better fingerprinting who our users are rather than what their behavioral patterns are is critically important. And there's a lot of technologies that can do that. I mean, there's technologies like software-defined perimeters that give you lots of granularity in being able to evaluate that incoming session. There's also a lot of reactive technologies that you need to have in place that are making sure that you know that you're monitoring for bad behavior. I think other things like we talked a little bit earlier about EDR platforms, right? I mean, we have to treat everyone as though they're in the coffee shop, which is a little scary, right? I mean, I think in the past, I don't know what percentage everybody saw on their networks of people working in random locations that might be a little bit not as clean, right? Well, now everybody is in a random location that's not as clean, right? And all of their kids are on their networks doing lots of scary things and watching weird videos on TikTok or whatever else they're doing that might be creating channels into their networks. So, you know, we have to treat all of that as dirty, and we've got to be able to protect that endpoint in ways we never protected it before. I take it back. Many of us probably had certain controls in place, but we probably didn't have the breadth of controls because we felt a little better inside of our offices, a little safer inside of our offices. Probably not in the right way, but you know, we did. So, yeah. Corey, thoughts?
Yeah, and the second one of the things I always say kind of goes back, it ties into the last slide and this slide is, and maybe it's because you and I, Paul, we think a lot alike, and we've been in security for way too long. And a lot of the stuff, like I hear COVID, and I say to people, COVID is just a precipitator of visibility, just like 9/11 was. The problem didn't create itself when the planes hit the building or when the pandemic came out of Asia. The problem has always been there. We were always supposed to do what we're supposed to do. And the problem is that you've got the draconian security teams that want to lock everything down. And then you've got shadow IT running rampant. And then their problem isn't the adversaries or anything else or the workforce. It's the workforce because they're now at home, unwatched, in a dynamic environment. And now they're all IT, they're Googling things. And then obviously for the ping, power, and pipe, most places, if not all, are going to be using split tunneling because we moved a lot of stuff that we could to the cloud for that reason. So we're like, all right, now you get all these scalability. What can we move to the cloud for ease of use? Because now they can go direct, email systems, for instance, if that's in the cloud, that's a huge attack vector. The thing that helped me with the COVID and the technology and the process isn't that it changed. It just forced the hand and gained visibility, much like the Boston bombing and the marathon and 9/11, and COVID's no different. I think it provided visibility, so security professionals need to strike while the iron's hot, because as all good things, they come to an end. So at some point, complacency is going to slide right back in place of paranoia. And I think what it's going to give the business is the ability to truly dissect things and start really making a stand and a stake for why these things aren't just insurance policies, because things like a pandemic that when we put on, I said a few slides earlier, was a joke we laughed about. Well, look who's laughing now. The people who predicted that a pandemic would happen every 100 years. Because I was like, these people don't know what the hell they're talking about. Age is a medicine. And I now had to eat my words because I'm like, wow, that I put it there as a joke, but we never really tested pandemics. And I think what it's going to do also is let us shore up some of the processes. And I know you had struck on a lot of the things that I leverage, the EDR, MFA, SDP, and then the other one that I didn't hear you say that also helped was for remembering passwords is SSO. We integrated that all into our SSO platform, so the users have an easier way to get into all the stuff, but we can still control that because it's going through now a single point, and we can monitor that single stream for deviations. Because prior to this, I was a huge proponent against single sign-on, because to me it's like, okay, now I have one password managing the passwords, but I realized that if you do it right and you really add the extra layer on and change the monitoring mindset from it, it actually can be your friend. So you're not, herding 100 cats. You only have to grab one cat and everybody follows the cat.
I think, we'll move on to the next one, but my point to add to this is I think you touched on it, Corey. This is a great time for us to combat against cybersecurity complacency. One of the easiest things that organizations could do, and they found that they could really do probably more easier now since everybody's remote and they're all now getting used to virtual platforms, is training. Opening up training, education, awareness. In the beginning, everybody was very, very click happy because they wanted to know what is going on, what's the newest update from the company, or the people that were just always clicking on the doggy and piggy and pony pictures and videos in their email. Now this was the chance to inform them, ramp up, not obnoxiously, but fish testing, but create environments where people felt like they were part of the cybersecurity process. Making sure that you had active training awareness programs out there. There's a lot of companies that are out there, ours included, that continue to move forward, making training free because it was something that could be accessible by everybody now. Everybody's virtual. They could be more cyber aware, and I think hopefully this will create a culture of cyber awareness that goes long beyond, and we don't need a global impacting event to understand that cybersecurity is important. We need to have it continuously as an evolving process, and we need to make sure that our workforce, the weakest link, right, is trained up to help to protect these organizations sometimes from themselves.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Let us not quickly forget.
Yeah, and I put in the chat too, one of the things I'm finding, and it's a challenge, which I'm sure anybody that's in a leadership position in security that has to go to the business for buy-in, is not only the training piece, but the unfortunate, or at least for me, even though I'm a security guy, this is my least favorite part of it, is enforcement and accountability. You can train people, but if they ignore your training and they're not being held accountable, you might as well just throw your documentation and training program in the toilet, because it's actually counterproductive, because then it becomes a laughing stock of the organization. So finding that balance and buy-in with the business is key as well with any training program, is you have to have some type of reward if they do well, but also punishment if they don't heed the warnings.
It's a great point, Corey. Thank you for that. I want to move on to the next slide because I feel like we would be doing a little bit of a disservice to the audience if we didn't at least touch on the SolarWinds breach. So in the middle of the rollout, many new vendor technologies into your environments. Of course, we just witnessed this major supply chain based attack with the SolarWinds breach. So have you made adjustments to your reliance or trust of third-party software based on these new vectors of attack? To the floor. Paul, you seem like you're eager to chime in. Walk us through your thoughts.
I am eager to chime in because, what's really interesting about this breach, it's not new, right? This is something we've been talking about. This is something I've had many conversations about, and it's something that I would say general best practices should be protecting in some way, shape, or form against a SolarWinds style breach with your third-party supply chain type attack. The challenge is that for the most part, we've been complacent about that style of approach. And when new software comes into our environments, most of the time our QA process is to lift security controls to allow that new software in. And all of the behavioral analytics and AI and all of these great things that we've built into security technologies, when you lift them to learn behavior of a third-party piece of software, and that learned behavior includes malware, it's very easy to inject malware into an organization that way. And that's what we saw with this attack. And so I honestly can't say that I have seen any of my customer organizations doing a lot about this today. And really, I haven't noticed or heard a lot of change that's been made. What I do think we need to be doing is enhancing our QA process, our QA testing, our evaluation of third-party code that gets brought into our environment, and almost a level of distrust until trusted. And so, unlike the world we live in, which, we used to talk about the GUI middle and we were protecting our perimeter, and I think we all got a little better about the GUI middle, but the new GUI middle is our third parties and our data that sits in cloud service offerings. Courtney talked quite a bit about some of the cloud controls that we need to have in place. And those third parties, our data is at minimum copied to a ton of third parties, if not resident in its core state within third-party platforms or SaaS platforms. And we're really trusting those organizations. And honestly, a lot of the best things that we're doing is evaluating maybe an SSA 16 or SOC 2 audit report, which isn't sufficient. Those reports are a point in time, and they're really a set of control evaluation that isn't actually ensuring that security controls are in place. So I think there's a lot of growing to do here.
And this isn't the first time. It won't be the last time, right? This is APT 101. This is advanced persistent threats. For every one that we hear about in the news that's been in an environment for 1 to 5 to geez, this one could go back 10 years. There's many more of them. So I think this there's been too much trust. This is the basis of zero trust. This is the basis of why tools like EDR are in place, is to have the proactive and reactive security. You need all of it together. You need to be able to spot anomalies. There was millions and millions of lines of code that had to be gone through one by one, because there is better processes, but sometimes if they weren't in place beforehand, you just got to do it manually. We need to get away from the manual. The only way to do it is to automate these security processes. These things are not new. Advanced persistent threats have been around for quite some time. That's why they're persistent. They've been around for 10+ years, just like this one. So I think for organizations, they need to move towards the more automated, not just EDR, but automated EDR. They need to move into platforms like SOAR, right? To bring in feeds from multiple different tools, vendor agnostic tools, bring them in, consolidate them, and automate security response. That's part of the problem here, is that we, for every bit of data that we bring in, every one of these new tools, every one of these new processes, it expands the environment, expands the attack surface. You cannot have in-kind resourcing. You're not going to bring in one more person for every tool that you bring in. You got to work smarter, not harder. And I think that's the tools have been around, the processes have been around, they're evolving, they're getting better with AI and machine learning, but they have to be implemented. They have to be put in practice and used constantly over and over to enrich them, to make them smarter. So I think that we've just had too much inherent trust with some of our third parties. We've seen the Microsofts, we've seen the SolarWinds, we've seen other ones have legitimate process being attached to, and we just trust that it's good. We need to be able to get better at spotting the anomalous behavior, the anomalous processes in an automated fashion, instead of somebody just, they may have found the one, as you said, hiding in a needle of needles. We have that automated process.
It's so cliche, but it's so true. People, process, and technology. You have to have the right tools, you have to have the right business process, and then the right skill set to be able to bring it all together. I appreciate that. We're running short on time here. I want to make sure we get to our last question because it is so relevant. As we have a large retail audience here. How are you planning for the new PCI 4.0 framework?
That sounds very Corey oriented.
Thanks. I was hoping I could stay on mute. I'm like, can we go back? Can we get rid of this and just go back to the last question?
We can go straight to the takeaways if we need to.
It's kind of the same process that I do, because every 3 years they're on a rotation now. So you kind of understand that year one, or really a 4-year rotation. Year one, which is the last year of the previous, you kind of get a flavor of what's going on. And then you do a bridge analysis to see how bad off you are. And one of the things that it's funny that Courtney had said about the last slide, that they kind of puts us in a little bit of a hardship with things like PCI 4.0 framework movement, is I always do an N-1 or -2 on patching major OS things. So for the thing for SolarWinds, we were lucky because we were behind. So we didn't have that. And then when you have a pronged approach of testing and things like that. It kind of lends into a lot of this stuff organically, but I think it goes around the feeds. Like Courtney had said, you got to get the information right from the horn. Don't get it secondhand. Don't go, make sure you're keeping your ear on the rail, listening to what the industry is saying and what they're kind of dictating, because PCI, for those that have worked in it, is kind of it's kind of bipolar or has multiple personalities. What's good today isn't good tomorrow, is good again the following day. So you kind of want to be mindful of it, but don't plan on anything until the last minute, and plan for kind of a shotgun type of deal, because a lot of things they'll change last minute. So I'm big in the councils, reaching out, organization membership, keeping up with the PCI council specifically, because I mean, if you can get on like a beta, I can't remember what they call it, but I'm not on it for PCI 4, but I was on it previously, like the consortium where you get early access to these things. I know it was insurmountable at other companies I work for, between 2 and 3.0. It helped me greatly because it was a huge uplift. So I got kind of a lot of headway. And a worst case scenario, if you don't have the internal acumen, I mean, we're not expected to know everything. I mean, I've been fortunate. I've been in the industry a long time, bounced around to different jobs, but you reach out to folks, ask consultants, even to come in for a day. I mean, just to give you kind of a lay of the land, just what to expect and things like that. And I guess don't be afraid to ask questions, because that's, Paul knows me, I'm pretty harsh on my vendors and things. Ask your vendors what they're doing for PCI 4.0 and ask them how their application is going to impact you, because I've had situations where I was thinking, what the hell am I going to do? And I found out an application we used put me in a completely bad spot. And I wasn't even thinking the vendors. I was thinking, oh, goes to Courtney and Paul saying earlier, third-party trust. I trusted that the third party was going to certify the application I was using, and it was just like, wash my hands of it, good, that's done. And I was grossly mistaken when I came up to the end of it. And then I had to do a lot of reworking, segmentation, and things like that around the application, sandboxing, that I was not prepared to do. And I wasn't even in a situation where my architecture supported it. So I not only had to do that last minute project, but I had to go back to the business, explain why I needed hundreds of thousands of dollars to do something that we shouldn't have had to do in the first place if I had just asked another question.
Yeah. Good insight. Thank you, Corey. Moving into our last slide here is just takeaways. I think that this has been a really hopefully helpful and fruitful discussion. We tried to summarize some of the data points here, just knowing that COVID has brought change, especially with how we all leverage technology. I think that may be a huge understatement, but the increases in technology usage and innovation has also increased our security risk. So important to recognize that. And thinking about how businesses must maintain and or increase customer satisfaction, which includes keeping data safe. Obviously, that is fundamental for running a business, is keeping your sensitive data protected. That's employee data, that's customer data, and kind of everything, your intellectual property. And just, as technology and innovation continues to happen, security must be top of mind and fundamental with how we do business today. And if we've learned anything over the past year, I think that we've learned the importance of flexibility. We must be flexible while prioritizing security. And then lastly, I think it's worth noting that strategic partnerships are important. It's hard to do this alone, and leverage reliable partners to be an extension of your team where you can, and let partners help you to navigate the rapidly changing environment together, and that can be partners like your technology partners like Fortinet, that can be service provider partners like SageNet, and we would love to come in and walk alongside of you in your journey. I want to thank everybody here. Thank you to the audience for showing the interest and logging on and participating. Thank you to our panelists, Courtney, Paul, and Corey. This has been really great. We appreciate your insight. If anyone that tuned in today has any more questions, please feel free to reach out. We welcome further discussion, and we would love to talk to you, understand your business, understand what challenges you may have, and brainstorm together as to how to overcome challenges that may exist in this this new environment that we live in today. So thank you all. I was trying to keep an eye on the chat room. I didn't see any questions come in, but again, reach out if you have any follow-up thoughts or feedback or questions. We'd love to help.
We were protecting Corey by not naming the innocent contact. We'll get holding him to
It's okay. Unfortunately, in a social and technological age, they have my name, so
He can be found.
it's
Yeah.
untrackable.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks,
Excellent.
everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
folks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.